On a brisk autumn morning in 1962, the camera crews outside the White House were bustling about, hoping to capture any glimpse of President Kennedy and his visitors. It was the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tension saturated the air like an unrelenting fog. But tucked away in a far corner of the manicured South Lawn was a sight that seemed wonderfully out of step with the moment's anxiety. A petite woman dressed in a simple gardening apron knelt close to the flower beds, carefully inspecting the roots of newly planted rose bushes. Her hair was neatly pulled back, her hands clad in soft, worn gloves. Although the turmoil of the world loomed large, Rachel Bunny Mellon was serenely at work, removing stray leaves and patting the soil with delicate precision, as if nature itself were more pressing than any global standoff. Almost no one noticed her, save for a few White House staff who recognized that behind those gentle eyes stood one of America's wealthiest and most influential women. To grasp why Bunny's life resonates on such an emotional level, it helps to glimpse the world she entered upon her birth in 1910. The bright lights allure of Hollywood's earliest studios was just beginning to shape the cultural imagination. But in her orbit, the quarters of wealthy East Coast families, there was a completely different set of rules for attaining prestige. The older moneyed circles did not chase fame in magazines or radio broadcasts. They built museums, funded libraries, cultivated exquisite gardens, and maintained a quiet distance from the throng. Anyone who aimed to maintain an aura of grace needed an appreciation for art, a dedication to tasteful philanthropy, and a manner of conducting life that whispered rather than shouted. Bunny was born Rachel Lowe Lambert to Gerard Barnes Lambert and Rachel Parkhill Lowe in one of Manhattan's most exclusive enclaves. Her father, a marketing pioneer involved with Gillette razors and Listerine, possessed a wealth that made her childhood entirely comfortable. Even so, from her earliest days, she displayed little interest in material extravagance. While many of her contemporaries in the social register spent days at finishing schools or practicing the protocols of debutante society, Bunny was happiest when left alone, amid flower pots and greenhouse benches. Family diaries reflect a telling anecdote. As a young girl of about 10 or 11, she was often spotted reading botany books with the same diligence others gave to etiquette manuals. Her father's staff would find her squatting on the edges of the estate, vigorously making notes about the soil composition or leaf structures. Such behavior wasn't typical for a girl groomed for high society, but Bunny showed from an early age that her real sense of comfort and identity sprang from nature itself, not from the ballrooms of Manhattan. This predilection for plants and design deepened as she entered adolescence. The roaring 20s raged around her, swirling with jazz clubs, speakeasies, and the first wave of glamorous film celebrities. But Bunny, though polite and obliging in social gatherings, rarely sought that brand of excitement. She seemed oddly old-fashioned, taking delight in color theory and carefully studying the relationship between sunlight and bloom schedules. Even her early sketches, stored away in private archives that remain largely inaccessible, reveal her keen eye for harmony. She labored over the symmetrical arcs of rose trellises and geometric layouts for kitchen gardens. In these personal notebooks, you sense a young mind discovering that art and horticulture could fuse into one breathtaking pursuit. Still, no one escapes the tide of family tradition entirely. By her early 20s, Bunny was ready to marry, at least by the standards of her social set. Her first husband, Stacy Barcroft Lloyd Jr., came from a background equally steeped in privilege. Though their marriage was pleasant on the surface, they shared a love for horses and leisurely days on country estates. It lacked a depth that truly nourished Bunny's soul. She grew fonder of her garden spaces than of society's endless dances and dinners. The union brought her 2 children, but whispers in the family suggested Bunny often felt ill at ease in a role that demanded she be the shining hostess of wealthy circles. She confided in a friend, "I'm certain I was made to plant seeds, not greet guests." That subtle dissatisfaction gradually frayed the threads of her marriage, which ended in divorce in 1948. Despite the heartbreak, the separation was managed with the same calm dignity that defined her entire approach to life. There were no sensational newspaper stories, no bitter accusations, just the quiet step of one woman retreating from a path that no longer spoke to her. The second marriage Bunny entered would profoundly change the trajectory of her life. In 1948, she wed Paul Mellon, the son of famed financier and industrialist Andrew Mellon, whose family represented one of America's largest private fortunes. On paper, it was a marriage of 2 aristocratic houses, the Lamberts and the Mellons, but at its heart, the union seemed to revolve around deeper sensibilities. Paul, himself an intellectual drawn to art and scholarship, found in Bunny a companion who valued creativity and contemplation over ostentation. They combined their resources to cultivate the Oak Spring estate in Virginia, a sprawling property that, over time, would become Bunny's personal horticultural laboratory and spiritual haven. Surrounded by rolling hills and lush meadows, she began to refine her signature style. Gardens that looked utterly natural, as though they'd been gently coaxed rather than forcefully constructed. Although overshadowed by Paul's vast philanthropy, Bunny carved out her own distinct philanthropic niche, supporting botanical research, art programs, and historical preservation efforts. She made substantial contributions to museums, sometimes donating entire wings of valuable art. Like her father, she believed money should flow toward improvements in public culture and knowledge. Yet ironically, she insisted her name remain invisible whenever possible. One biography, penned by Merrill Gordon in later years, includes an anecdote that Bunny once withdrew a large donation upon learning the institution planned to name a gallery after her. The matter was quietly resolved, but the message was clear. Bunny Mellon sought anonymity over recognition. This retiring nature might seem an odd fit for someone who was also close friends with figures like Jacqueline Kennedy, a first lady who was arguably among the most photographed and scrutinized women of her era. Yet the two shared a profound bond rooted in artistic sensibility. Jackie, elegant, refined, and simultaneously burdened by massive public attention, recognized Bunny as someone who embodied grace without the glare. Early in John F. Kennedy's presidency, Jackie enlisted Bunny's help in reimagining the White House Rose Garden. At the time, the garden looked charming enough, but Jackie and Bunny dreamed of something exceptional, a space that balanced the ceremonial needs of state visits with an intimate atmosphere reminiscent of European palace gardens. Bunny's approach was meticulous. She pored over the White House's historical records, studied the soil composition, and examined the interplay of light and shadow at various hours. Then, with the precision of a painter selecting hues for a masterpiece, she began reworking everything from the layout of the flower beds to the types of shrubs that would frame the garden's pathways. By the time she was finished, the rose garden embodied a gentle sophistication that left onlookers enchanted. Instead of being a stiff, formal space, it radiated warmth. No single element screamed for attention, yet every corner of it whispered grace. The grand unveiling saw journalists lavish praise, crediting Jacqueline Kennedy for her aesthetic vision, while Bunny stood in the background, accepting quiet thanks, perfectly content with her role behind the curtain. Her friendship with Jackie deepened beyond horticultural projects. After the tragedy of President Kennedy's assassination, Bunny became an emotional anchor for the bereaved First Lady. She offered Oak Spring as a respite from the unrelenting gaze of the press and the swirl of political chaos. The two would take long walks through the gardens, sometimes speaking in hushed tones about loss, other times wandering in silence as they observed the quiet rustle of leaves. A rarely noted detail comes from a now unpublished letter Jackie wrote to Bunny, discovered recently in a private collection. In your garden, I find not the memory of a world lost, but the promise that beauty can still flourish, even when our hearts are broken. The letter, written just months after JFK's passing, underscores the profound emotional haven Bunny provided. Still, even as these moving episodes unfolded, Bunny seldom revealed her private thoughts to the outside world. She was adept at listening, an art she'd refined through years of social gatherings where she'd preferred to remain quiet. According to one anecdote recounted by a former staff member at Oak Spring, Bunny would often say, "Plants can't speak words, but they reveal truth if you're patient enough to observe them." This was not just her philosophy toward gardening, it was her approach to people too. She believed in gentle observation over loud proclamation, a hallmark that made her a cherished confidant. Some members of the extended Kennedy circle even joked that Bunny must have had more state secrets than the CIA, yet one would never have guessed from her mild, unassuming demeanor. While she might have thrived in the shadows of political and social grandeur, Bunny did not isolate herself entirely from the broader cultural currents of her time. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Hollywood's film industry was enthralling the nation. Grande dames like Bette Davis or stars with smoldering allure like Elizabeth Taylor were grabbing headlines. Bunny's name, on the other hand, was seldom in the papers, except for an occasional mention in society columns describing a discreet philanthropic function. And yet, paradoxically, Bunny Mellon's lifestyle embodied the dreams of a certain Hollywood ideal. The perfect estate, the perfect garden, the luminous dinners under starry skies. One actress of the period, rumored to have visited Oak Spring, is said to have remarked, "Visiting here is like stepping onto the set of the most tasteful period drama. But it's not staged, it's real and it's heaven." Indeed, for those few privileged enough to cross Bunny's threshold, her world was a potent blend of authenticity and fantasy, cultivated with as much care as she lavished on her prized roses. Tragedy, however, did not leave her untouched. Her stepdaughter, Eliza Lloyd, died tragically in her early 20s, and Bunny felt that loss as a haunting echo of the ephemeral nature of life. Then, in 1999, she faced the passing of her beloved husband, Paul Mellon. By that point, Bunny was inching closer to her 90s. The loss of her partner cast a somber tone over Oak Spring, yet she pressed on with her routines, rising early to consult her gardeners about the day's tasks, occasionally making small adjustments to planting schedules, as though continuing to shape life's course would mitigate the encroaching loneliness. Those close to her recall that, while she maintained her composure in public, she privately suffered moments of deep sadness, turning to prayer and reflection. She never quite shared the full depths of her grief, except in scattered diary entries that remain under lock and key in the foundation she established. From those who've had the rare opportunity to read them, we learn that she once wrote, "Loss is the winter of the heart, but gardens teach us that spring always follows. I must believe that even in the darkest nights, seeds of hope lie waiting to bloom." Her philanthropic efforts continued in the new millennium. She channeled substantial resources into the Oak Spring Garden Library, amassing a collection of rare botanical texts and manuscripts that scholars from around the world would someday study. She also supported various philanthropic organizations dedicated to historical preservation and the fine arts. Visitors to Oak Spring in those years, journalists, foreign dignitaries, even a few Hollywood figures, remarked on the quiet discipline that underlay every facet of Bunny's existence. Despite her advanced age, she often walked the estate herself, sometimes using a golf cart if the distance was great, but just as frequently traversing it on foot. She wanted to personally see that each corner of her land adhered to her exacting standards of understated perfection. And then came the twist that no one, least of all Bunny, foresaw. In her final decade, a fateful connection with Senator John Edwards thrust her unwillingly into a blaze of media attention. Edwards, a charismatic politician with a compelling life story, caught Bunny's eye, most likely because his message of hope and renewal reminded her of JFK's youthful spirit. She began to donate to his campaigns, never suspecting how these gifts might be repurposed. When Edwards's extramarital affair was revealed, sparking a broader investigation into whether he had misused campaign funds to hide the relationship, Bunny's name exploded into headlines that had hitherto largely ignored her. Prosecutors alleged that hundreds of thousands of dollars from her contributions were secretly funneled to cover up Edwards' affair and the child born of that affair. For a woman who had kept her entire life shrouded in layers of discretion, the scandal was excruciating. Journalists dug into her background, combing through property records, old interviews, and philanthropic disclosures. They referred to her as the billionaire banking heiress. Though her primary involvement in banking had been tangential at best, papers published unflattering photos, straining to show her as a wealthy recluse who had blindly supported a politician's deception. Some insinuated she'd known all along what her money was being used for, while others portrayed her as a kindly old lady manipulated by a cunning candidate. Even close friends were divided. A few believed Bunny might have turned a blind eye, preferring to remain ignorant, while others insisted she was entirely in the dark and mortified by the breach of trust. Legal proceedings dragged on, marking a stark contrast with the hush and calm that had always defined her environment. Edwards stood trial, and although the jury ended in a deadlock on most charges, leading to an acquittal on one count and dismissal of the others, the ordeal served as a deeply troubling epilogue to Bunny's life. She was never personally indicted, but her involvement had come under uncomfortable scrutiny. At 90-something years old, she had to reckon with the realization that the very generosity she had always expressed could be twisted into a scandal of national proportions. Friends say she weathered the storm with stoic composure, seldom complaining about her own anguish, but occasionally shedding tears in private. She found respite in the quiet corners of Oak Spring, among her greenhouse projects and the comforting hush of old horticultural texts. In retrospect, one might argue that the Edwards scandal overshadowed Bunny's final years in public memory. But the question remains, does a single, scandalous brush with politics negate a lifetime of artistry, philanthropy, and heartfelt service to beauty? For those who truly knew her, the answer is a resounding no. Instead, they point to the vast portfolio of gardens she designed, from private estates to philanthropic sites, and, of course, the White House Rose Garden itself, an enduring symbol of American grace in an often chaotic arena. They remember the quiet dinners where Bunny would seat an eminent art historian next to a local horticulturist and watch them forge unexpected friendships. They recall how she would sometimes slip out of a grand party to check on a newly planted magnolia sapling, anxious that it might need extra support against a forecast of wind. Historically, Bunny Mellon's significance straddles multiple spheres. In the realm of horticulture, she pioneered a brand of landscaping that combined classical symmetry with a humble reverence for nature's own patterns. She was influenced by French formal gardens, but also by the pastoral charm of the English countryside, blending those influences into a distinctly American interpretation of outdoor space. Art and antiques experts admire her for her discerning eye. She championed pieces that, while sometimes simple at a glance, captured the essence of craftsmanship. Culturally, her friendship with Jackie Kennedy placed her in the thick of 20th century American legend, providing glimpses behind the scenes of political power and personal tragedy during the Camelot years. Through her philanthropic lens, she preserved a precious trove of horticultural knowledge for scholars of future generations. Yet for all the abundance of her achievements, perhaps the most poignant aspect of Bunny's legacy is her quiet defiance of what society typically expects from a person of her stature. She never built a media empire, never chased accolades, and never sought to plaster her name across institutions. Instead, she moved through the corridors of influence with a subdued, almost ghostly elegance. This calm presence drew in the powerful and the famous who craved refuge from the frenetic demands of public life. She offered them gardens, libraries, artworks, and, more importantly, a sense of interior calm that had become scarce in their own worlds. In recent years, glimpses of her diaries and personal correspondences have added texture to her story. One particularly moving letter, written in the early 1970s to a distant cousin, reveals the depth of her private introspection. In gardens, I have learned that life is a delicate balance between controlled shaping and letting nature run its course. Perhaps this is how we must treat our relationships and even our tragedies. A little guiding hand, but not too tight, lest we smother the potential for new growth. This principle, so simply stated, might well serve as the philosophical cornerstone of her existence. She believed in cherishing beauty, in letting it unfold, yet offering the occasional nudge so that it might flourish in a more harmonious pattern. Bunny Mellon passed away on March 17, 2014, at the age of 103, leaving behind Oak Spring Farm and its extensive library as a resource for future generations. For her funeral, the service was held in a small, intimate chapel. In contrast to the elaborate tributes that typically accompany the departure of billionaire philanthropists, Bunny's farewell was as understated as her life. There were flowers, of course, most cut from her own gardens, but no ostentatious displays. People spoke softly about her spirit and generosity. The memory that lingers from that day is of a light drizzle falling on guests as they walked among the very gardens she had designed, the earth damp and fragrant with the scent of fresh rain, a final reminder of the cycle she cherished so dearly. While Bunny's story might initially seem out of place in a spotlight typically reserved for Hollywood legends or political titans, there is an undeniable dramatic arc that resonates with older audiences familiar with the golden eras of cinema. Her life parallels some of the most compelling classic film narratives. A reserved heroine who inhabits a world of privilege but finds her authenticity in the quietly beating heart of nature. Like a character in a sweeping romantic epic, she crossed paths with heads of state, navigated societal storms, endured personal tragedies, and emerged with her sense of purpose intact. The difference is that her stage was not the silver screen, but the living tapestry of gardens and philanthropic institutions. There's a rarely cited story that encapsulates her delicate blend of influence and modesty. In the 1970s, Bunny attended a dinner in Washington, D.C., where several celebrities and notable European royals were also present. The hostess led the guests into a sumptuous dining hall, filled with tall candles, crystal chandeliers, and centerpieces bursting with exotic orchids. It was a grand spectacle fit for the cover of any high society magazine. At one point, an acclaimed European countess approached Bunny to compliment her on a rumored new greenhouse at Oak Spring, describing it as legendary and unrivaled. Bunny demurred with a soft laugh, saying something to the effect of, "Oh, it's no legend, just a place for quiet cultivation." People nearby nodded politely, but the hush that followed was telling. In that crowd, everyone knew of Bunny's resources and her capacity to create wonders, but they also knew she had zero inclination to trumpet them. The moment passed without fanfare, just as Bunny liked it, but the memory of that graceful rebuff circulated among the guests for months. It was as though they'd witnessed something rare, a potent demonstration of how power can be clothed in humility. It's hard to encapsulate a woman who, in 103 years of life, witnessed such sweeping changes, both in the broader culture and in her own intimate circles. Yet if we have to choose a single thread to follow through the labyrinth of her experiences, let it be her devotion to the notion that one can always create moments of stillness and beauty in a tumultuous world. She carried that torch from her childhood fascination with seedlings to the grandeur of the White House gardens, from the heartbreak of personal losses to her final foray into scandal-laden headlines. Nothing in her story suggests she ever wavered in that core belief. Looking at the Rose Garden today, where, over the decades, many presidents have stepped out to make historic announcements, it's easy to forget that a gentle, soft-spoken horticultural genius once knelt there in the soil, pushing aside layers of mud to position the roots of a rose bush, just so. And in that single motion, she left an indelible mark on the American cultural psyche, because each time a televised press conference or a state ceremony takes place among those blooms, we're reminded that artistry can permeate even the most formal places, that elegance can temper the hardened edges of power, and that behind every masterpiece, be it in marble, film, music, or living flora, there's often a humble soul quietly coaxing it into being. Bunny Mellon's life offers a profound reflection on the interplay of fame, discretion, art, and humanity. In a world captivated by sensational stories, she demonstrated that genuine character can thrive outside the spotlight, shaping destinies and experiences in ways that transcend news cycles. Her restraint and her eye for the understated provided a moral and aesthetic counterpoint to the extravagance that often comes with immense wealth. When we consider her narrative, we see a tapestry threaded with the best and worst of what privilege can bring, the capacity to create sublime beauty, and the vulnerability to become ensnared in controversies we neither sought nor understood fully. May her story prompt us to reflect on our own capacity for discretion, friendship, loyalty, and artful living, and to remember that sometimes, like Bunny herself, the most extraordinary lives unfold softly, scarcely leaving footprints, yet still leaving the world immeasurably more beautiful than they found it. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.